and seeing action and becoming a hero for the oppressed. Johnny Canuck would not have any superpowers. However, he would be an ace pilot. He would be a highly skilled hand-to-hand combatant. He would be highly trained in the use of a wide array of weapons, ranging from knives to handguns to rifles to machine guns. He would be an Olympic level swimmer. Much like Bruce Wayne, he was a man who had trained himself to peak human physical condition. And there will be an element of Flash Gordon in Mr. Bachel's Johnny Canuck, as in many of the early adventures, Johnny often found the top part of his wardrobe being ripped or pulled off of him. He very often appeared bare-chested in many of those original adventures. During his 4-year run in comics, Johnny would travel to Germany, to Russia, to Japan, to China. He would also have adventures in Libya, in Cairo, in Yugoslavia, and in Tibet. In terms of Johnny's physical depiction, his look and physique were based entirely on Leo Bachle himself. Something which would come to create a bit of a problem in later years, but I'll talk about that later on in the show. But it was quite clear that Johnny Canuck was an idealized, or not an idealized version of Leo Bachle, but living out an idealized vision of what Mr. Bachle had wanted to do in his earlier years. Now, I gather that this was a bi-monthly release, given that there were 28 issues, but the stories appeared over a 4-year run. Essentially, Mr. Bachle would put together a story, and he'd take in all of the finished artwork to Cybele, who would not even take a glance at the work. He'd simply take the stack of artwork, put it in a filing cabinet until it was time to take the work to the publisher and just say, okay, kid, go on and draw another book. And that was something which Mr. Bachle really came to resent. While he appreciated having this job, having a means to provide for his family, he did wish that he would have received, words of encouragement or just words of job well done from Cybele, especially given that Johnny Canuck was not the only character that Mr. Bachle created and wrote. At his height, Mr. Bachle was actually drawing, writing, and lettering 6 comics. He took the rejected concept for the Bat and turned that character into the Brain, which became a well-received co-feature in Dime Comics. And I should mention that Johnny Canuck did not appear in the self-titled comic book. He did appear in the Dime Comics anthology. I don't know that he was always the lead feature. I expect that he was. But Johnny appeared alongside the Brain, and possibly even Thunderfist. Thunderfist was not created by Mr. Bachle. However, the creator of that character enlisted in the military, went overseas, and so Mr. Bachle became the writer and artist on Thunderfist as well. Now, getting back to the Johnny Canuck title or stories, there were 2 things that really stand out about Mr. Bachel's run on Johnny Canuck. First, the artwork was breathtaking. There's nothing dated about Mr. Bachel's artwork for Johnny Canuck. You take a look at it, and it looks better than some of the art which is actually produced in the present day with the aid of computer technology. There's just such a high level of detail and realism in Mr. Bachel's work. Just to look at the story without looking at the text boxes and the word balloons made for a really great read for young readers at the time. In terms of how Mr. Bachle presented female characters, he knew how to draw beautiful women. I mean, I've talked about in the past the whole bad girl craze in the 90s, and there's still a fair amount of cheesecake art out there today. But Mr. Bachle knew how to draw women who looked beautiful without being scantily clad. And he also presented female characters as strong, independent, resourceful women as well. They weren't just damsels in distress. They were spies or double agents or members of the underground resistance against the Nazis. The other thing which really stood out about Mr. Bachel's work on Johnny Canuck was that in an age where most stories were one and done, i.e. there was a beginning, middle, and definitive end to the story, Mr. Bachle was writing entire story arcs, stories which took anywhere from, I'd say, 5 to 6 issues to tell the whole story. Each chapter ended on a really great cliffhanger, and even though the splash page on the next issue would help get the reader up to speed, one really got the feeling that they had to stay current with the book, because one paragraph at the start of the next issue just wasn't enough. The reader really needed to be there at the store every time a new issue came out. Something else that was really interesting about Mr. Bachel's run on Johnny Canuck was that his hero actually confronted Adolf Hitler. And, I think of various comics covers from the Golden Age, from National Comics and Timely Comics. There's that one issue of World's Finest where on the cover Superman, Batman, and Robin, they're throwing fastballs at Hitler, Hirohito, and Mussolini. Of course, the cover for Captain America #1 shows Cap punching Hitler in the jaw. But you'd open up these comics and the stories would show the heroes still fighting evil in the United States, whether it be Nazi agents or war profiteers or common crooks. You didn't see the heroes go right into the heart of Berlin and stop Hitler in the course of a day. And in a year's time, National or DC Comics would explain that Hitler had come into possession of the Spear of Destiny, so that if the heroes did enter Nazi headquarters, Hitler would simply put them under his enthrall. So this was a way of keeping the heroes in check. And yet within the first arc of Mr. Bachel's Johnny Canuck, Johnny confronted Hitler no less than 3 times. And what really impressed me was that there was a real back and forth between Canuck and Hitler. They were formidable adversaries for each other. And Mr. Bachle really showed readers just how frightening and evil a person Adolf Hitler was. I know that when it comes to someone so disgusting as Hitler, a natural inclination is to present the individual as a buffoon and a simpleton, and to say, oh, well, he was sick. And Hitler's ideas were sickening, to say the least. But to say that he was a sick man gives room to, for a number of people, excuse him for his actions. And there's nothing excusable about it. What was terrifying about Hitler was that he was a cold, calculating person, highly organized. He knew how to manipulate the mindset of the people. He knew exactly what he was doing. And in the pages of Dime Comics, we saw just how calculating and evil a character he was. There was no buffoonery in Mr. Bachel's depiction of Hitler. So I really appreciate Mr. Bachle for adding a layer of realism in his depiction of the back and forth conflict between Hitler and Canuck. And in the end, neither man bested either one. Because, of course, Mr. Bachle was aware that in real life the war was still raging on, and he wanted to move Johnny into other avenues, specifically Russia and later Japan. Mr. Bachle's star was certainly on the rise within Bell Comics. He was working at a rate of $4 per completed page, which was actually an excellent salary. And he was so happy to be providing so much money for his family. He had a young friend at Bell Comics, Ted Steele, and Mr. Bachle was able to use his influence to encourage Bell to hire another of his friends, Ross Saskin. Looking ahead to Mr. Bachle's final arc on Johnny Canuck, it was set in Japan, as Johnny was sent to parachute into Japanese territory to try to help Allied supply lines get in and to shut down the flow of Japanese supply lines. And this final arc by Mr. Bachle was very dark, much darker than the earlier arcs, and there was a very angry tone to it as well. And this arc was rife with the use of a three-letter word which is used in a very derogatory manner towards people of Japanese descent. I think a lot of you can put two and two together at home and understand what word that is. Johnny Canuck, Dime Comics, was certainly not the only comic to use this term. A lot of comics that were being produced around 1945, 1946 were highly racially charged, very insensitive towards the Japanese. And basically, what happened over the course of this arc is that Johnny gets kidnapped, or not kidnapped, sorry, he gets taken prisoner by the Japanese, and Japanese general is trying to extract key information from Johnny, and Johnny's having no part of it, and he is subjected to some pretty brutal torture by the general and his men. He is deprived of food and drink, and the general goes so far as to, in one scene, take dirty matchsticks and jam them under Johnny's cracked fingernails to the point where his fingers bleed underneath the nails. And given Mr. Bachle's high level of detail and realism in his art, just a painful image to see. And I mean, in the earlier stories, Johnny would get taken prisoner all the time, but he always found an inventive way to get out, and he always had some reserve of strength within him.